Hey, this is our first video of the APES curriculum, and it is 1.1 Introduction to Ecosystems. So take a moment to check out the Enduring Understanding, look at the learning objective, and pause the video as you review the essential knowledge and set up your Cornell notes. Okay, so I'm going to discuss topics throughout this curriculum, and your task is to write down the key points for reference at a later date. Remember, these are notes to future you, so if there is something that is very obvious to you, you don't have to copy every last piece of information down, but definitely if there's something that you are learning for the first time or there is a connection that is made, you definitely want to take note of that. So today we're going to be talking about ecosystems, and in the order of organization, we start with the simplest, and that is an individual or a species. When you put a bunch of species together, you get a population, which is the second ring. When you put different populations together, you can have a community. So for example, you may have a individual human being. You put a bunch of human beings together, you have a population of human beings. Then you put humans with other biotic organisms or other living organisms, and you have a community. You may have a community of humans with some mice, roaches, dogs, other living organisms, plants, mold, bacteria. When you incorporate the communities with their abiotic factors, then you have an ecosystem, and the ecosystem is what we are going to be discussing today. Put a bunch of ecosystems together, you will have biomes, which we are going to be talking about in the future. And finally, the biosphere is the area on the Earth where life exists. And that can be anywhere from the deepest parts of the ocean to the upper levels of the troposphere, which is a part of the atmosphere where life has been found. And when we're talking about organisms, we have interactions between these organisms, and they can be either interspecific between different species or intraspecific within one species. Again, interspecific between two species, intra within one species. So intraspecific reactions or interactions would be found in a population. Interspecific would be found between members of a community. So some biotic interactions, one example is predation. So this is when you have a predator, in this case it would be a cheetah, and a prey, that might be a gazelle, some sort of African savanna herbivore. So the predator is getting the food from the prey is losing their life. So when you graph this out, the prey population is going to be higher than the predator population, and you'll notice that there will be peaks and valleys for the prey and peaks and valleys for the predator. And they will be offset slightly, and we will be discussing this at a future time. Another type of biotic interaction is herbivory. And in this example, we have an elephant, which is an herbivore, eating grass or some type of plant, which is a producer. And this is an example of an interspecific relationship because we have two different species. And we have symbiotic relationships. And sym means together, or syn, and bio means living. So we have living organisms that are living together. And there are three examples. There's actually more examples, but there are three that we are responsible for knowing. We have mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So mutualism, you have species A is happy, species B is happy. In this example, we have pollinators. We have a bee that is getting pollen. It is getting nectar from the plant. It's getting sweet food source from the plant. And the plant is dropping its pollen off on this insect, which it will then transfer to another plant. This is aiding the plant in reproduction. So the insect is getting a food source and the plant is able to reproduce. Other examples would be a lichen. A lichen is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. And a coral is a symbiotic relationship between an animal, and an algae. And we will be discussing these more in detail in the future. Okay, with commensalism, we have species A is happy and species B is unaffected. This example has the clownfish and the sea anemone. And sea anemones can sting organisms that come into contact with their tentacles, but the clownfish are unaffected by these. So the clownfish gain a safe place to stay. It's a form of a habitat, and the anemone is unaffected. Other examples are cattle egrets, and cattle egrets are birds that live in areas where there are large herbivores. You may have seen water buffaloes in Africa, and they have these little birds maybe on their back or nearby. Well, what these birds do is they eat insects and invertebrates, or small little vertebrates as well. They eat these organisms that are stirred up by the actions of the herbivores. And the cattle or the water buffalo, they are not affected, and the bird is getting a food source. A remora fish looks like a parasitic fish. Some people consider it parasitic, but what they do is they hitch a ride on a shark, for example, and they are feeding off of different things around the shark, and the shark is unaffected by it. It's annoying, but they're still unaffected. We have parasitism. That is where one organism is happy and one organism is negatively affected. This example is the mosquito. The mosquito's happy, it's getting blood from the organism. The other organism, in this case it's a human, is unhappy because it is discomfort, it is pain, and there may be diseases that are spread with this mosquito. Another example is a strangler fig. This is a type of plant that grows around another plant, and it actually strangles it. It gets food source, it gets water from this, and it eventually takes over. It has a safe habitat, and then it takes over and eventually will crowd out its host organism. A brown-headed cowbird we will talk about later in this unit, but a brown-headed cowbird is a nest parasite. They will lay their eggs in another bird's nest, and the other bird has to take care of their birds, and the parents don't have to do anything. So they're basically hitching a ride. Another type of interaction is competition. And as you may remember from Living Environment, in competition, both species are affected negatively. That might not seem like it makes sense, because it might seem like an organism, when you compete, you get stronger, but that's not the case in nature. In fact, we have what is called the competitive exclusion principle. So basically, you would look at a population of a species over time, and this population would grow and eventually reach a carrying capacity where it levels out. Now, population A can grow to this population density, and population B, or species B, would grow to this population density. However, when you put them together, their populations will be decreased, because one of them is going to have a slight advantage over the other, and neither population will be at as high of a density when they are put together. So in nature, we have, you've seen this in fact during Living Environment, we have certain types of birds with their beak size is also related to their size seed that they can eat. Now, there is variation. Some birds have really small beaks in this species. Some birds have really large beaks for this species. Most of them are middle of the road. Okay, so the population is going to be highest for those birds with the medium-sized beak for this species. And then very few will be really small, very few will be really large because of natural variation. Now, we have another bird, another species, with a larger beak. And again, some of them might have much larger beaks for this species, and some might have much smaller beaks for this species. And notice that beak is larger. Now, this becomes a problem when the smaller beaked red birds and the larger beaked blue birds, their food source or their seed size may merge. And in this case, there is going to be competition, which is a bad thing. So one thing that might happen is the populations of both of them would decrease because of this competition. But then over time, what's going to happen is the smaller beaked redbirds and the larger beaked bluebirds will decrease to the point that the populations would actually those organisms with larger beaks for the redbirds and smaller beaks for the bluebirds would be favored. So over time, these populations will vary, and they will change eventually. And this is a form of resource partitioning. And partitioning just means like when you space something out, and we can have different types of resource partitioning. In this example, it was morphological because it is the form or the shape of their body. The size of their beaks will partition. So the smaller beaked birds will take the smaller seeds, the larger beaked birds will take the larger seeds. But you could also have spatial resource partitioning, and that's where organisms may occupy a different space. Some organisms might live at the bottom of the tree, other organisms might live at the top of the tree. That way they're sharing the resources and avoiding competition. That is the key to resource partitioning. In addition, you may have something that is temporal or separated by time. Some organisms might feed in the morning and some organisms may feed in the evening or might be nocturnal. So they're they're sharing the resources, but they're not competing directly. So at the end of every lesson, there's going to be an FRQ practice. And remember, I want you to follow the rules or the suggestions that have been given to you. When it says identify, simple response, single sentence. When it says to describe something, it's 2 sentences, and you need to answer the question and then basically give an example. So in this example, remember this is a food web, and we haven't talked about food webs, but the arrows are showing who is doing the eating. So in this example, like a copepod is eating the phytoplankton, and it's also eating the algae. Okay? So based on the food web indicated on the left, identify 2 organisms that compete for a shared food resource. Describe how resource partitioning could reduce the competition between the 2 organisms you identified. Thank you very much for your attention. I will see you soon.